to come to a common ground would be to put your questions on text. Otherwise, there's no way of me reading your mind. That's the first thing. The second thing is what I've tried to focus on is things which will be helpful. And this also doubles up as things which I have seen people frequently do, uh, and it not being a very nice thing for them in rounds, and it severely impacting the way that their performance plays out. So more than anything, this can be a glossary of the most frequently asked questions on being comparative, and all the advices that I have gotten through the years and everything that I've observed and learned put into one place. Cool. So I don't have any slides as such. I'm sorry I did not get the time, but I have a rough Google Doc that I will share at the end. There are three broad sections to this workshop. The first is to understand what happens when you miss out on a comparative. Uh, and here, I just want to explain the instances of the most common instances of missing out comparatives and how severely that can affect a team's ranking and what are the implications that it has on debates. This is important to understand because it kind of sets the context for why even we should care about this concept in the first place. So that's that. The second is how to do a comparative well. um, I would I'm going to highlight a couple of things here. The first is where all can you apply this idea of being comparative and in what ways? So, how can you be comparative in your mechanisms? How can you be comparative in your impacting, which is essentially weighing? And how do you do it in your engagement? The last thing then is assessing the margins, right? Because once teams have been comparative, I still don't think they weaponize it enough to kind of make it an advantage for their side. So I would just want to explain a bit of how using a bit of meta commentary and how using a bit of weighing you can actually bring out the full extent of your full extent of what it meant to be comparative in the debate, and why that was something that should be viewed as incredibly strong for your side. Cool. First thing then, what happens when you miss out on the comparative? There are two broad things that happen when you miss out on a comparative. The first thing that happens is that you allow the other side to establish one for you. And in most instances, because they also care about winning, probably probably to an equal extent that you do, they are going to establish a comparative which isn't as strong and which isn't as descriptive. Simply speaking, it's going to be an incredibly weak portrayal of what your side is indeed supposed to be defending. Cool. What is an example of this? An example of this is the motion, which is quite rudimentary, quite elementary, because of how commonly we see this clash. It's this house believes that feminists in Western liberal democracies should adopt reconciliatory rather than confrontational approaches in their advocacy. I think the clash is quite simple. The clash on Gov obviously says that you should go for things or go for advocacy efforts which don't stir up a storm, which are more palatable and which are viewed as more reconciliatory. And the obvious impact that you're going to claim or pull from this is things like opt in, things like better relationships, like what kind of people you convert, people who otherwise might not be wanting to be convinced by the movement, all of that. And an op, it's quite simple that being confrontational would mean having a radical advocacy of approach, and efforts towards that direction would attract the most loyal of believers, people who believe in this cause to the most extent, and all the benefits that flow thereafter. Things like them showing up to more protests, them contributing more heavily, it being a safe space for these individuals, all of that. Um, Now, you might be wondering what is this, or how does this, how does a team on any side try to abuse the lack of a comparative from the other. Now, I've seen this play out, so I will use that as a reference. But there are many other ways of abusing the comparative that we can discuss if people want. So, in the instance that gov teams choose not to explain what a reconciliatory approach is, the most common, or not the most common, but a very easy way for op teams to now go ahead and say is okay, so gov teams want us to reconcile with every individual or a vast majority of individuals who might have anything to do with feminism, or just the vast majority of people in general. A very uncharitable read of this from op can just be that you now also try to say to people that, oh, you shouldn't report people who make you uncomfortable. You shouldn't report people who you accuse of like who you accuse of assault or like aggravated advances which you might not be comfortable with and things like that. The exact wording that was thrown at me in the round that I did was, okay, now you're asking victims to make peace with their assaulters and tell them that it's all right, and that creating a furor over it is something that's not the feminist movement, like is something that the feminist movement doesn't believe to be in its interests. And the reason this characterization or this comparative like painting of your world will be bought by judges is because you don't give them any other reason to believe otherwise. So what this clearly does for gov is that it derails their case by making it apply in instances that it absolutely does not. Because the most common interpretation of gov is going to be that you adopt a reconciliatory approach in your households because it's difficult to be confrontational with people that you also have other relationships with, like your father, like your brother, and things like that, or even a social leader in your local community and things like that. So most commonly, the conception of this motion from gov is going to apply in those instances and not in the instances that op is saying. But if you miss establishing a comparative, if you miss establishing what is it that your side is equipped with defending, what is it your side chooses to defend, then it becomes incredibly easy for the other side to claim your stance in the way that they want. That is a very short intro, like that's a very brief way of explaining what can go wrong if you don't have a comparative. That is one of the biggest problems. The second big problem is you cannot claim any uniqueness for your impacts if you don't explain what is the comparative you're defending. So, if in this motion on Gov, you choose not to explain what a reconciliatory stance looks like, and you choose not to explain in what way will the feminist movement play this out in these Western liberal democracies, on op they have the ability to just say that, oh well, this impact might as well happen on our side of the house. So if you are going to argue opt in from gov because you can now pander to more stakeholders, or if your mechanism is in similar lines, opposition has the ability to say, oh well, stirring up a protest also attracts a lot of new individuals, and that is also something that matches up to the impact that gov has outlined. So the biggest problem that now appears is, on gov it's seemingly intuitive that the kind of people who opt in are vastly different from the kind of people who opt in on op. But because you did not characterize or you did not explain what this comparative is meant to do on your side of the house, it becomes incredibly difficult for any judge to buy that both of you are wanting to affect different stakeholders. So that is the second huge peril of not impacting. Not like establishing a comparative, that you cannot claim any unique impact for the stance you defend. That is the broad problem on missing out on the comparative. Uh, Before we move on to the next section of how to do the comparative well, I just want to visualize the levels on which comparatives can exist. Comparatives can exist on all levels. The first level on which it exists is both sides being incredibly clear with the stances that they want to defend. if the motion says this house prefers a world where dogs had superpowers over cats, then it's quite clear that opposition has to defend a world where cats have these superpowers, and Gov is tasked with supporting a world where dogs have these superpowers. But in more broader instances, motions do not really lay out what the other side's stance needs to be, or what the other side necessarily has to say in the debate, right? So, but this is just commonly understood in a lot of motions. So, let's take the example of bans motions, right? If someone says the motion is this house will ban high frequency trading, the most obvious op comparative to this is going to be that you can regulate to deal with the harms that Gov proposes, and that it is simply not important to ban this concept, ban this practice as a whole. In this instance, it is quite intuitive as to what is the exact comparative that you want to go with. Or in other instances, right? If the other instances, this house will militarily intervene in Sudan, or this house would militarily intervene in, say, Iraq, in those instances also it's quite intuitive what an op stance to it is going to be. It is going to be that you don't put boots on ground, but you do everything else. You assess the diplomatic like the kind of diplomatic solvency you can have. You try to push diplomatic talks, you try to send in aid, you try to negotiate with these leaders, so on and so forth. So in these instances, it is still a bit clear what the comparative or what the stances for the other side is going to be, right? But what about in instances such as this house believes that the feminist movement should actively adopt the practice of shaming in order to correct the behavior of individuals? Um, in this motion, it is a bit unclear what ops exact or precise comparative is going to be, right? Um, one op comparative can simply be to say, okay, I really don't care what happens on op. I am just going to explain why the practice of shaming to correct behaviors is incredibly bad and incredibly opposed to the kind of impacts that you want to achieve. But another side can very easily just claim that, oh no, the kind of approach that we want is to have a sit down with people. It is to make them aware that what they're doing is wrong, because in the vast majority of instances, people are blissfully ignorant of the kind of stereotypes that they participate in and the kind of practices that end up excluding a vast majority of women. So, in this instance, if in prep you're not clear what op is going to run or what kind of op world you are going to deal with, you are going to be in big trouble. Like if you're in Gov, of course, because the mechanisms for one comparative are going to be vastly different from the mechanisms you employ in another comparative. If the kind of world that opposition chooses to defend is just a world where they want to explain why the benefits don't exist, but the harms weigh up more severely, on Gov, if you just were to explain that people care, like if your mechanism is people care a lot about their social standing, because that determines the amount of respect that people endow them with, and that is extremely important for their self-esteem, because that makes like that then decides if you're included in social circles, if you're added to gatherings, if your friends still want to talk to you, if your mates think you're cool, and things like that. That would be a reasonable kind of mechanism if op is just that we don't care about the precise comparative, it's just that we are going to show the harms are bigger. In that instance, this mechanism is something that can be seen as complete. But in the instance when the comparative is quite different, and it's that, oh, there is a sit down that is going to exist on op, it's going to be a very soft approach of dealing with people and explaining them to them very calmly why they are wrong, then then the mechanism is quite different, right? Or the extent at which the mechanism is seen to be complete is quite different. because now you would also have to explain, in addition to saying why people correct themselves because they care about their social standing and why shaming helps for that, you also need to explain why, when people are corrected in a softer way, it does not deal a blow to their social standing. And hence, this mechanism cannot be taken up by op as well. Because if your mechanism on gov is shaming leads to people being more cognizant or defensive about their social standing and hence they change, op can say the same thing. Oh well, you can softly call people out in social settings as well, and the same kind of incentive structure would come into play of why I want to preserve my reputation in a like gathering or in a society and things like that. So of course, then I think on gov, the way to fulfill or the way to complete that mechanism would be to then explain why being soft or being explained to in a very calm and composed manner does not trigger your social reputation the same way. And you can just explain that, oh, because this can just like people might not understand the severity of it unless you make the severity clear. And the severity of things is only uniquely made clear when shaming as a mechanism exists. So that successfully explains why that person won't feel a threat to their social standing on op and won't take that kind of chiding seriously or won't take that kind of intervention so seriously. So, unless you are very, very clear on what op teams have to defend, you are not making clear mechanisms. You are making mechanisms which have a shot in the dark and a 50-50 chance of being bought in the round. So, the first level at which you need to be comparative is to understand what the other side is defending. And in most instances, I think it is good practice to establish at the top of your speech itself why op comparative should exist the way you believe it to exist, right? Because in an instance like this, I would just say from PM that look, being like not recognizing problematic patterns in your own behavior is a huge issue. Sure, you might not think of it as a huge issue because people don't necessarily act on those things like all the time. You might talk over other people, or you might have a like some kind of hidden cognitive bias to prefer masculine qualities over like seemingly feminine ones for leadership roles. But when you congregate them, when you accumulate them, when you see them as a sum of many individual behaviors, when 100 people start doing these small actions on a repetitive basis, then it becomes a huge thing. So opposition also has a clear cut problem to deal with. And this is why, if not shaming, in most instances, it has to be some kind of soft mechanism through which you deal with these things. Because otherwise, then it's just unclear why people would still be able to retain these connections, right? In most instances, it's not inaction that exists. It has to be some kind of action. And that's why this is the kind of action that you take on op. So the first level at which you need to be comparative is when you're clarifying the stances that both sides have. Otherwise, it can become incredibly messy going down the debate when the other side can just have the liberty to choose whatever trail they want to like then tread. So that's the first level at which you need to be comparative. The second level at which you need to be comparative is your proof. So all arguments have two broad pillars. The first is its proof, the question of why is this true, and the second pillar of its impact, the question of why is this important. Being comparative applies to these two pillars as well. First, let's look at proof, or let's look at the question of why is this true. Here, it comes down to mechanisms, right? And you must be wondering that, oh, in most instances, isn't it just enough to say that this doesn't happen on the other side, and hence that's why it should be true? Like let's take an example of a really simple motion. Maybe something like this house opposes confidence culture. This motion is just okay. Sorry, there's an info slide. Confidence culture being the broad culture that you should be self-assured, you should have assertiveness, you should try to achieve these kinds of expressions. and that just being confident is seen as a virtue rather than anything else. um, I, I think that the most common kind of opposition argumentation here is just going like the most common impact on op is going to be you now meet more people, access more opportunities, because confidence makes you come off as like when you're more confident, you talk more. So presumably you talk over a range of common issues or overlapping interests and things like that. So in those instances, you simply end up getting more opportunities. I think that here it is not just enough to say that you get enough opportunities when you are confident. That is partially true. I think it makes more sense and it's far more convincing when, on the same metric of opportunities, you also analyze the converse of why being quiet or not expressing yourself rid yourself of those opportunities. Here, you can simply explain that, well, in most instances, what leaves a lasting impression is how confident you were, what kind of interactions people had with you. And if you were a forgettable or a not so remarkable personality, then there are high chances that people simply wouldn't think of you when the right opportunities come their way. So they won't send you a referral, or they won't ask you to join their team, which certainly needs members at that time, and things like that. So the broad idea, while proving mechanisms to be comparative, is to identify a criteria on which your mechanism exists, right? So in the initial, like in the last example about confidence culture, the criteria is opportunities. Your mechanism on op explains why you will have more opportunities. Like the mechanism then need like the only instance in which it is comparative is when you explain that on Gov, in most instances, you won't have the same kind of opportunities. Let's take another example, right? And this is far more clearer because the comparative is clearly set out. This house believes that the feminist movement should support the narrative that beauty does not matter over the narrative that all bodies are beautiful. um, so I think that here, uh, if you were to be on op, if you were to defend the narrative that all bodies are beautiful instead of the narrative that beauty does not matter, there are several mechanisms that you can have for the argument of which is more believable, right? uh, for each mechanism to be thought of in a comparative sense, you need to establish a criteria for that mechanism. So, if the first mechanism that I have for why the narrative of all bodies are beautiful is just much more believable and hence should be advocated for by the feminist movement, it might be because uh, beauty is so easily perceivable, and we always, in most instances, assign a value to beauty. People have written so much about the beauty of nature, the beauty of individuals. So it's just something that's very easy for us to assess in our minds when we view anything. So this is partially complete. And the criteria on which this rests is this like the perceptual value of it? How easy is it to perceive this narrative over the other one? So once you have identified that this is the criteria that my mechanism rests on, then you can just do the simple task of explaining why the criteria is not met on the other side. If the criteria is the like what is more easily perceivable or what is more often perceivable, you can just explain that the idea that beauty does not matter is very difficult to not perceive because individuals on a daily basis keep on valuing beauty. It has experienced you in multiple like you have experienced it in multiple scenarios, so it's just very unintuitive for you to not buy into it. If another mechanism that you have is oh, maybe a lot of people tell us that we are beautiful all the time and we want to believe in it because it makes us feel good. So if the criteria that you have identified is that this makes you feel good about yourself, then on the comparative you can just simply say that, oh, why wouldn't want to believe in the idea that beauty does not matter? Because People want to have those small moments of joy when they are told that they feel pretty. So it's harder for them to opt out of that or simply not believe people when they tell them this in a very loving manner, so on and so forth. Another criteria can just be that, oh, when you say that all bodies are beautiful, maybe the beauty industry will happily support that, happily endorse that narrative, have this on advertisements, try to collaborate with your campaigns as the feminist movement, and say something like, since everyone can be beautiful, here is our product to make everyone beautiful. But on the comparative, when you identify the criteria at play here is what will the beauty industry do, you can simply now realize on like the way to make this comparative is to explain that the beauty industry is very likely to fight back on the op comparative when they have like when the beauty like industry is faced with the narrative of beauty does not matter, because it is seen as a huge risk to their business itself. So, in all these mechanisms, you first need to identify what is the mechanism relying on, or what is the criteria on which this mechanism is working. In the first instance, the criteria was, oh, we perceive beauty extremely easily and everyone has lived it, so it's easy to rationalize. Versus on the comparative, you can't say beauty does not matter because we ourselves value beauty. So it's very difficult to then like actively opt out of that belief. The second instance in which we were able to identify a criteria was that we feel good when someone tells us that we are beautiful. So you want to like the criteria then becomes is that believing in it makes you happy. And on the like then the way that you explain on it to be comparative is just to say that we can't believe beauty does not matter because our lived experiences has proved that appearances do impact our daily lives. They do negatively also harm us in many instances, such as they help enforcing stereotypes and things like that. So, and similarly, in the last mechanism, if you have identified that the criteria that this mechanism rests on is what will the beauty industry do, or how will this industry particularly react, then you know that you need to then compare to the other side on the same criteria. So, when you are being comparative in proof, you need to identify what criteria is my mechanism reliant on. So, to visualize this, you have kind of three columns. In the first column, you put down your criteria, which shouldn't ideally be longer than 2 or 3 words. And in the first, like in the second column, then you put what Gov will say. And in the third, you put what Op will say. Obviously, this varies depending on which side you are supporting or opposing. I like to visualize mechanisms in this way because this forces you to be comparative. Because when you see an empty column in front of you on your proof sheet, you are simply forced to say something on the comparative. This is good for habit building because, in most instances, the excuse that people have for being uncomparative is, oh, they didn't think of it being crucial. Oh, they didn't think of it mattering until someone brought it up. So, the way to get around this and a useful heuristic is just to have a 3 by 3, like not a 3 by 3, but a 3 column table and whatever number of rows, depending on how many mechanisms you have on your sheet. In the first column, you just have what is the criteria you're defining this by. In the second, you have what Gov says on this criteria. And in the third, you have what Op says. And depending on whether you're Gov or Op, you frame your mechanism in that particular way. This way, you just have an empty cell or an empty blank staring at you if you haven't thought of the complete comparative mechanism in that instance. This is far better than writing mechanisms in an. Oh, obviously, this is up to individual preferences, and there is a case to be made against this as well. But this is good for forcing yourself to be in a situation where you are forced to have something that's comparative for that mechanism to begin with. So I think that this is a really good way to practice finding comparative mechanisms and to also put this into practice during mocks and other kind of stuff. So this is the second level on which individuals need to be comparative, which is their proof. What is the third level on which you need to be comparative? The third level you need to be comparative on is impact. And this is the most intuitive kind of comparative understanding that all of us share. because I'm just in very fancy terms explaining weighing, right? When you are comparing impacts, you are just explaining on a weighing metric why one thing matters more than the other. And this can be a number of things. I won't delve much into the kind of weighing metrics, but I'll just list out the most common ones. A very common way to compare impacts can be certainty. The certainty that something happens versus the certainty that something does not happen. The second most common way in which you compare impacts is simply scale. Your impact has more number of people being affected versus opposition's impact having less number of people. The third kind of impact is often things like special obligation, right? The common word for this is vulnerability, but the better way to understand this is owing a special obligation, because just someone being vulnerable doesn't really explain why they should be prioritized. Explaining why we owe a special obligation to vulnerable individuals is a far better way of imagining the same weighing. The fourth way in which like lot of impacts are compared is intensity, right? Even if a benefit were to materialize to 100 people, would it be as intense for their lives? Would it make really a huge difference? Versus on the other side, if the other side has the same impact impacting like 2 3 people, but it just uproots their life, changes the course altogether of the reality that they were living, then obviously the intensity to which they are affected is much more. So in that instance, you can explain why that matters more than the scale. So the point that I was trying to like by listing out these several like points of contention in terms of weighing is just, in this instance, you can think of being comparative by thinking of what do I need to do in order to win the weighing battle. Because in most good rooms, both sides are going to have weighing for what is already believed. Then in those instances, the way to be comparative is how, yeah, sorry. In those instances, the way to be comparative is then to explain which weighing is more accurate. And that is the part while comparing impacts that a lot of people forget, right? And that is something that I did while explaining the last impact of intensity. If you are able to show intensity is a weighing metric for your side, but opposition has scale, there are explanations for why both should be the like on both sides for why one side should be believed more over the other. If it's intensity, you can just explain that, oh, like these people's lives being severely derailed by this is something that they will definitely more deeply care about than 100 people being affected for say like one small thing in their life, and that is something that they obviously don't care as deeply about. But on op, you can just explain that on utilitarian grounds, when you impact though, like when you look at the small change in those people's lives over a long time span of say 5 to 10 years, then you can see that this snowballs into something that's a huge kind of a change or a huge kind of an effect. And in terms of utility, you should always care about maximizing pleasure in that sense. So, hence, scale then becomes a more important metric, so on and so forth. So, while being comparative on impacts, it is not just enough to say that you have weighing. In most instances, it comes down to explaining why your weighing is more appropriate to be bought, or why your weighing is the more accurate one for the frame in which the debate is playing out. So just in like in very crude terms, weighing the weighing itself. So that's the third parameter on which you need to be comparative often, which is the impact. What is the fourth level on which you should be comparative? And I think this is quite important because this also has a brief note on rebuttals, right? So, one of the most common questions that people have, and one of the most common confusions that people have in debating, is how are rebuttals even assessed? Because, in my view and experience, the way that people evaluate rebuttals and the way that people weaponize rebuttals is quite wishy washy. In most instances, only the rebuttal which has the maximum strength from one side is the one that's often brought into the discussion, and a lot of other rebuttals are just left as strays because their value is not often understood in a round. And this is where I think the fullest potential of a rebuttal can be understood. That is, while having comparative engagement. When you make trade offs, you should always try to make them in the way of an even if. And this is the best way of being comparative while engaging. What do I mean by all of this? Let's take the motion of this house will legalize drugs. It is a no brainer that op is going to say, but no, there are a lot more people who will now be hooked onto drugs, and that's bad for several reasons. I think it is quite obvious and intuitive that this is the kind of argument that op is going to push into the debate. So I think the way that you have so the idea of being comparative in trade-offs is you don't have to concede everything. You only have to concede what is necessary. So, in what an even if in this instance is going to look like is that you just say that, oh, if opposition is planning to win on the idea that far more number of people now become drug users, this is something that's unlikely to happen for a bunch of reasons. Like a, the social discouraging mechanism still exists. People still frown upon these kinds of individuals who have to cope with drugs and who have like no other coping mechanisms. Things like people, there is massive awareness of the problems that a life of like a stoner's life has, like the causes to individuals, and how inaccessible rehab is and things like that. And see that in most instances access is not often easy to these drugs. So even in the instance that it's legalized, it's going to be over the counter, you need a prescription and things like that. So if you were to make the trade off without this bunch of preemption, you would be conceding far larger ground to the other side. So, in this instance, being comparative without preemption would not have been the best strategy. So, in a vast majority of instances, you need to be aware of when to be comparative. It might seem as very strategic to have the comparative rolling from the first second of your speech, but in most instances, it's good practice to just have a frame which minimizes the extent to which you need to be comparative to begin with. So now, if you have minimized the extent to which op argument can exist, now you just have to show that people like taking safer drugs is much more important than a bunch of maybe 100 or 1,000 odd extra people now opting into the scenario of taking drugs and things like that. So you need to really, in most instances, choose where you employ the trade off or where you start being comparative. So, in instances like these, where it's crystal clear what the other side is going to run and what their comparative is, and in what way it's going to be weaponized, the better way to use your comparative engagement strategy is to first explain in a vast majority of ways why that benefit doesn't happen to a large extent, and then be comparative and explain that even if it happens, it is okay for XYZ reasons. So this can if you are doing this can obviously happen in two ways. The first way in which it can happen is either you are setting up a frame right at the beginning of your speech, or in the second way it happens is you just are responding to a material that's brought by another speaker. So this is the fourth level at which individuals can and should be comparative. But again, so I think the most common problem with all of these levels is just how do we enforce it, right? Because I think that becomes the most common issue in rounds as well. There are just two things that I would want to say here. The first is you can create heuristics of your own, or you can use one similar to the one that I suggested. So, for mechanisms, right? I think all mechanisms can be boiled down to a criteria or can be boiled down to like a heading or a category, because mechanisms do exist like that. A mechanism is just a way for showing something happens. It's a reason for why something happens. That reason is premised on a concept. It can be a psychological concept, it can be an economic concept, like the beauty industry's reaction. It's an economic phenomena. Like the idea that we perceive one narrative more easily, that's a psychological phenomena. So, in these instances, it's easier to enforce this practice by having a three-column table where on the first column you just write down the metric on which you want to compare the mech. Then in the second one you have the like the way you would draw the comparative from gov, and the third column has the way that you would draw the comparative from op. Obviously, if you're gov, you would explain why on that metric or on that defined criteria you have better chances to do well, like, or that mechanism is just much more believable or effective from gov, and vice versa for op. So this, I think, really forces you to build that habit for yourself. The second thing I think is just mindset, right? uh, I think by mindset I mean is because if you are not thinking in a comparative sense right from the get go, you are going to be brushed away by the intensity and the pressure of the round. So if you don't, the first thing in the prep is not like, if the first thing in the prep is not the comparative that hits your mind, and you start case building before identifying what both sides should have as stances, then you are presumably just shooting in the dark, because in the vast majority of instances you are not even aware of what you're comparing towards. And this is not something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to answer. It's just as a mindset, it was difficult for you to see that as the most important thing to first discuss before moving on to other things. So, in most instances, you need to think from a comparative mindset. And this also has to be integrated in rebuttals, right? Thinking like the first obvious question that you have to, like, whether it's a mechanism, whether it's an impact, is why is this comparative? And in the ways that we just discussed in the earlier section on being comparative on all four parameters: stance, mech, impact, and engagement. So, in those instances, it's just very important to think from a comparative sense. A lot of people are able to program their minds to be this way. A lot of people are able to have hardcore heuristics like age on paper or something already pre-written before the round on paper for them to be able to enforce this. I belong to the second category because I just truly think that a lot of things in a debate room are outside your control, and it's very easy to be brushed away by the intensity and like easy to submerge under the pressure that's coming your way. So in most instances, I think it's just better to then have these kinds of heuristics. And this is just the most common one that I've seen, and the most, like, this is the only one that I've actually employed. So I can't suggest any other which have reasonably worked in my experience. But you are welcome to come up with your own heuristics, whatever they might be. A lot of people I have seen, they fold a sheet in half and they only write on one side of the sheet. And what they do with the other side of the sheet is they fill in the comparative there. So if they are following someone else's speech, suppose the LO is speaking and I'm the DPM, when I'm tracking your sheet on one side of the paper, on the other side with another color or the same color, I write my comparative thoughts. That is also something that I've seen people see. Similarly, when they're writing their own speech, on one side they'll have the flow, and on the other side they switch a color, they write the comparative that they think is necessary at that level. So there are these two ways that I think you can enforce that mindset to begin with, and that just is quite helpful in most of these instances. That's the second thing. The third thing, or the third section that I then wanted to discuss for this workshop, is being dynamic, recognizing that comparatives change and how to then adapt to that situation. Before that, are there any questions? I seem to have seen one on chat. 1 second, chat is loading for me for some reason. Can we outframe mechanisms on the other side, or beating each mechanism is the most optimal? Um, so I think this depends from round to round. In most instances, so if you are, say, closing, in many instances, I think that your opening would have already tried to outframe what the like kind of mechanisms from gov are, so that attempt to do it the same way will be seen as repetitive and not just be contributed as unique material to you. So in closing, then the way to have some kind of unique credit for beating that claim from gov, or claim from op, will have like, it needs to be direct responses then to particular mechanisms. So it is also a round wise strategy. If your opening has done one strategy, then it's better to focus on the other, because that's the only thing, like you only get unique credit for doing something once. Yours won't get the same credit if you are closing. So that is often the kind of dilemma that you'll like face yourself with. But the second thing is, I think it totally depends in a lot of instances, like based on instance to instance. In a lot of instances, there is very little framing out you can do, because the kind of trade off is just undeniable. So you need to realize what your frame does. Your frame might not completely beat the implications of that mech, like in the drugs motion. The frame that the number of users won't change, it doesn't say that op doesn't exist and op's impact cannot be realized at all. It says that the change won't be much. So in those instances, I think the most obvious scenario in DPM would be to just look at LO and just to see that how much of LO's mechanisms has been dealt by with the speech that you had, and how much is something that you now need to uniquely deal with. Because if like if the PM frame had some analysis on why people's perception won't change and why people's psychology around drugs won't change, maybe the LO has to have a very different, like maybe if the LO has a reason which is not on any of these criterias, then there might be a need to directly address that, because your frame simply does not account for it. What if there's a massive economic reason that LO has for explaining why the number of drug users increases, and that has nothing to do, or your frame has nothing to do then in the debate to that mechanism, because your frame just explains the way that people socially view it and not economically interact with these things. So then there would be a direct rebuttal, or there would be another attempt at framing which is needed in that instance. So this is a call that you need to take from round to round. There is no one clear way of going about it, is what I've understood. Cool. The last thing then is, uh, just realizing what is the correct comparative. So I think that sites or teams, a lot of teams that I've seen recently, and like even in my experience, I have also done this a lot, is people start out with absolute comparatives. On our side, this person will get economic relief. On op, there is no economic relief in most instances. And it's quite easy to guess that it's just very easy for an ops side to come up with responses to that and say that, oh well, look, this economic relief can exist on our side as well. So there is this, any motion, right, like about economic aid or economic relief, let's say like Biden's subsidies during the COVID pandemic, uh, if the idea is that you should support it or not, um, gov will obviously say that this, like these subsidies, basically it was a $2,500 check right in your bank account for every American citizen around the world. So, because it was the peak pandemic period and people literally did not have a lot of sources of income to deal with whatever expenses they had to deal with. So, the gov most obviously will say is, or in most instances, what the gov sets out to say is that there is no other avenue through which you get the same kind of relief in the quickest or in the same time frame possible. So, I think that in a lot of instances, op teams are going to come up and just explain that why these kinds of benefits will still accrue anyways. And op teams can just argue that a lot of, and like obviously in response to this argument, they will argue things like a lot of non-state actors, a lot of NGOs on ground, and even state authorities will give out things which are extremely important in those instances. So if it's energy, if there's an energy crisis per se, states are actively going to lower or going to do something about those energy prices. They're going to impose a cap and things like that. That is to say that there are going to be a lot of efforts made from the state that might just dampen the blow of that economic crisis to begin with. So it's unclear to see why this money then is so important. So here, in most instances, teams might begin from a comparative of we have quick money that op cannot show. Now that op has shown that state has an equal incentive to give welfare for goods and services and to make them cheaper instead of giving direct subsidies. The clash is not now, or the comparative now is not that we have money which helps people get what they want, because op is also arguing that what you want is often subsidized by the state, and that is a better way to achieve the same impacts. Now the clash or the comparative has evolved to either a people in vast majority of instances, or like the needs of the people are different from the needs that the state is going to subsidize, maybe those kinds of things. So here presumably I would argue that the state can't subsidize the cost of education in these most instances because it's a lot of private tutoring that you just cannot put a cap on and things like that. At the bare minimum, it can do it for electricity, it can do it for gas. So it's just much better when direct subsidies are given for people, so they have an ability to make a choice for what they want to prioritize spending towards. That would now, yeah, sorry, that would now be a more accurate way to explain what the clash should be or what the comparative should be. So, in a vast majority of instances, the comparative often shifts between like mid debate itself, and it's not something that you can fully devote to from prep because there might be an op line that you just didn't see coming. So, in these instances, it is important to realize that comparatives can shift and it is important to adapt accordingly. So, if at PM you started out with the comparative that this gives you a lot of money, and that's good. And an op, you don't get the same amount of money. And given the crisis, it's important. An op is able to, in LO, show that you get the same benefits through other ways. Then I think in DPM, the comparative becomes the preferences of the individual are far different from the preferences of the state, and why individuals should have the ability to choose for themselves. That is then what becomes the comparative of who is a better arbiter or a better decision maker for their own preferences, or what exactly, or even another comparative on the same line could just be that states are extremely inefficient at doing this and trickling down the benefits, while individuals can do it far more directly. So the comparative then evolves to where can you access that benefit more directly instead of the comparative being I access that benefit, op does not. So it's very important in a lot of instances to flag to judges that you are shifting with the change in comparative itself. And this is also important to note in terms of prep strategy, right? You need to ask yourself, is there a very easy response that I'm missing to the comparative that I've thought of, which just dramatically changes the comparative that I'll have to prioritize in, say, DPM and Gov with? And if you were to think like that in prep, you would probably realize that it's a bit disingenuous or unfair to say that there is no way op can get the same kind of benefits. There is definitely a way, which is subsidizing utilities at the state level and not having to give individuals like money in their bank account. And then you would come to the realization that, oh, maybe the debate is about whether directly you can access them better. Maybe the debate is about, oh, should individual preferences be respected far more because they're so diverse? And then you would have a more robust comparative which does not fall to the same responses. So in round, between the round, if you were to realize it, it's very important to flag it to judges. It's very important to say that this is what the comparative has evolved to. If in prep, it's very important to think of this way, think as the devil's advocate, and think what the other side is most likely to say in these instances. So this was a short note on what I believe needs to be also kept in mind during the round itself, or even before the round starts. So that was the last section of what needs to be the dynamic understanding of comparatives. And that, I think, concludes the material that I had. Any questions? Okay, so if we are Gov and Op did not give Carac regarding certain premises, should we be charitable while giving a comparative for them to engage? Because accusation comes, Gov is not being charitable for Op. Uh, the thing is that in most instances, I would assume this to apply from opening itself, because that is when you will run into the problem of facing an op which has the idea or which has the outlook that, oh, this is not quite charitable. That is where this applies, right? That you just take the trade off, or you be comparative in a very smart sense. You just don't say that, okay, if op were to make this, if oo did not make that argument, like for some reason, and you did not have a chance to respond, you just don't weigh against the absolute strength of that op argument. So if the idea is this house will legalize drugs, and for some reason o does not make the argument of this will now incentivize more people to use these drugs, and CEO is planning on making it. In DPM, it's not a very good idea to take the trade off before it's been made. So you don't, or you should not necessarily weigh against the absolute strength of the op argument, because that is quite a strong argument. And if made effectively from CEO, your weighing or your like whatever weighing you do in OG won't be sufficient. So you always need to see how much ground am I conceding. So the way to go about that then would be to concede as less ground as possible. This is not meaning that you are uncharitable. This is meaning that you have preemption to already mitigate whatever might come on this. And that is where you try to preempt and then take the trade off and then compare that, even if this is true, why what I'm saying is still far more relevant and important. So if you were to make the comparative trade off that way, there are less chances of you running into a scenario where you are called uncharitable. The second reading that I have of the question is, what if the kind of comparative you set out in PM for op to defend is something op team claims to be like difficult, or op team say that, oh, this is quite narrow. That is why it's important that for both sides you have reasons for why the comparative is the way it is. So if the motion is that the movement, feminist movement, should be reconciliatory rather than confrontational, I think the way, you don't need to explain or you don't need to prove that gov is reconciliatory, op is confrontational. What you need to prove is what is the nature of these reconciliatory efforts from gov, and what is the nature of these confrontational efforts from op. And if you were not to explain that, oh, we would just like the kind of people that we are aiming our advocacy towards on gov is people who are not related to the movement yet. It's people like allies or moderate men even, or women in rural areas who have a very conservative outlook and things like that. So if you were to not make that characterization, and if you were not to explain why your side's comparative plays out in that way, then the other side has the full ability to just characterize your idea in the way they want. And obviously, they would do it in the worst way possible. So it is better. So, like in most instances, it is with proof that if you substantiate something, there are less chances of you being called out for uncharitability. Because if you were to examine the proof of this setup, right, you would automatically understand that it's quite uncharitable. Because an O can get away by beating an OG by explaining that, oh, it's the kind of reconciliation is absolute. It happens, needs to happen with everyone. A victim has to reconcile with their perpetrator, but a CG is going to very easily take this down. So if on OO, you just need to ask yourself, why is it true that reconciliation will happen in this way? And you will find yourself struggling for reasons, right? So, in that instance, I think that's a good litmus to check if you are going with the most charitable premise or not. And that's why often when you're PM or LO and you're setting up a comparative for the other side to defend, you need to have reasons for why it's the most likely way that this happens. So, on OP, it is still okay to say something like, oh, this will happen only in the most rural of areas. You can narrow the gov debate down to those areas just by saying that, because in more urban spaces, in more progressive spaces, this is just not possible, because the feminist movement has already launched like a wave of feminist progressive programs, and this won't be like kind of consistent with the ideology that they have advocated for the in these spaces so far. So then that means logically that this debate is confined to conservative spaces on gov, and hence we are going to now argue how these people are likely to react and things like that. So that is a comparative substantiated by proof of why a comparative is the way it is. But if there is no proof for the comparative, then it might quite be possible that you are called for out for it, and it ends up becoming uncharitable. So being uncharitable, like in that sense, it might give you the win over one side, but in the larger run, it's definitely going to hurt. And the best way to avoid this is just to ask yourself, okay, why is it necessarily true that we have to defend this comparative and the other side has to defend that comparative, whatever it may be. In this instance, I think you can just argue why those extents matter to these individuals, right? Because if it's true that maybe they're already living in ghettos, so an example can be these people, they already live in ghettos which are bereft of utilities. They don't get a lot of common basic requirements that people need. That is the current characterization. And if one side is saying that, oh, they already live such a terrible life, what we are just doing is dispersing them from that ghetto. How could this be any worse from what they're already facing? So that's why the oppression is justified. I understand that to be the reading of the question. So if that is the question, then on Gov, in response to this, you just need to argue, or you just need to defend the change, right? What is changing is, though these people lived in shitty conditions, they lived together. So then you are arguing the community value of living together and why it was like why it's necessarily good. So things like a in a lot of instances, the ability to collectively negotiate for small things, such as blockading some kind of, I don't know, like sewage line or industrial pipeline, which otherwise could have been easily built across that neighborhood. But because 5,000 people came out of their homes, and even if these are kacha houses, even if these are slums, it's just that it becomes very difficult to crush such a collectivization. And then the media notices these things and things like that. So maybe they were able to collectively bargain for a lot of things that they otherwise wouldn't. Maybe they were able to get things like tankers on Sundays and Saturdays instead of not getting water tankers at all, and hence not getting access to clean water. Maybe they were able to have community, like in a communal way, raise their children, and that was good because they have now other people to share their sorrows with. They have other people to share responsibilities with. They have other people to see as family, and like that's just a net good in and of itself. So in these instances, extents can just be defended by seeing what's changing, and when you identify the change correctly, you're able to identify the comparative correctly. So the comparative then becomes from there is oppression to there is no oppression. It changes to why community living is far more important than anything else, and why it doesn't happen on their side. So that is the kind of change that you would want in the comparative, and that's how you would defend it. Uh, this house would, this house believes that X should do Y. Oh, So it honestly depends on the motion. The best answer I can give you is proof. So I will just give you an example to show why this is difficult to say. This example is what a lot of people thought was a very difficult gov. The motion says this House believes that opposition parties in illiberal democracies should strongly pivot towards empowering women as the primary focus of their campaign. THBT, opposition parties in a liberal democracy should strongly pivot towards empowering women as the primary focus of their campaign. And this was the same dilemma, right? It's THBT's X should. Here, OP has a lot of comparators to choose from. Ops can, like, if it's an illiberal democracy, an op team can just argue why focusing on democratic backsliding is far more important as an agenda rather than focusing on empowering women. uh, Another comparative that op can just have is if these are illiberal democracies, maybe there are violations or infringement on minority rights, and why that's far more important for this opposition party to care about rather than empowering women and things like this. Uh, Another op team can just say is that why it's important to care about the economic stability of the country more than anything else rather than empowering women as the primary focus. All of these are legitimate comparatives, and in most instances in many different rooms different comparatives were actually run and different opposition teams won. This is the round 3 motion from Vietnam Worlds. In this instance, it is now quite easy to see that there is no clear single answer to this. The clearest answer I can give to this question is just what can you prove? What do you have the capacity to prove, right? Because in all of these instances, all of these comparatives are kind of effective against what Gov is saying. And a lot of these comparatives did win against what Gov was saying. So, in this scenario, I think in prep, you need to realize that look, you have been blessed with an instance of multiple comparatives. What then should the comparative be? I think it depends on two metrics, right? The first is whether I can prove this particular comparative to be true. And the second is whether I can prove this comparative to be more important than what Gov is defending. That being answered, or those two questions being dealt with in prep, will help you ideally find what is the most effective comparative to run. I'll give another example. This house believes that religion should actively advocate for an outlook of life where karmic reincarnation exists. uh, so karmic reincarnation is the idea that you take another human birth or you take another birth in this world in whatever shape or form. uh, and that next birth is something that's a certainty. So there are two ways to view the op on this, right? There is really one way, but for the sake of making up another comparative, the first comparative I could make up is, oh, I am going to argue that the comparative is heaven or hell or karmic reincarnation. This is what most debates end up being about. The second comparative that a lot of teams might argue is, oh, the comparative to karmic reincarnation, repaying for your sins in following lives, is like kind of karmic balancing in the same life, repaying for your sins in this life. And the problem with this is just quite evident. The first problem with this is, why is this true? Why is this comparative true? Because what is the reason? Even if the comparative is true, it's very difficult to see a strong reason for religions to advocate it in this particular way, or religions to make people be convinced in this way of living. So you will often see yourself struggling with one of these two questions of why is this true and why is this important when you have the wrong comparative. And that, I think, should give enough of a hint to change the comparative that you're focused on. That would be one. And the most common way of seeing this is, what will the other side's reaction be, even if you can't think through those two questions of why is this true and why is this important. So I think that is the best way to then see like how these comparatives are reached, or what is the most optimal comparative to be run. Similarly on THR motions, right? A lot of comparatives can be proven to be true, but what, like in most instances, determines your comparative is what is stronger, right? So I think in these instances also, even if you can come up with like multiple comparatives and for all of them you have solid proof, the difference then would be which comparative is stronger in my opinion, and for whatever comparative you have stronger reasons, you should go with that. I would say there is no clear way of doing this. The clearest way I can suggest is know all the basic clashes. When you view more and more debates, when you look at more and more like motions, if you know the apparent or the clear trade offs in those motions, then it would not really take a long time for you to identify comparatives in prep. So, a drill that I was told, which I unfortunately never followed, was take 10 motions on a theme and be a bit specific with it, right? So, if your theme is religion and death, go to debate data, look for motions with those two words, and then you have a list of 10 motions that you collect, and then you do a short prep for all those 10 motions, and then you just see maybe you have two arguments each for gov and two arguments each for op, or maybe you try to identify the two clashes in each debate, and then you just look at a frequency chart, right? What is the most commonly occurring clash, or what is the most commonly occurring argument from each side? And then you would come to realize that, oh look, there are a bunch of very famous and stable clashes or comparatives that keep up coming in debate. Things like trickle down or redistribution. This is a very classic motion which comes wrapped in like glittery packaging in every other tournament because they just change the context of it. Things like radical action or soft action or soft appealing. This is also something that's a clash that we just discussed, and this can exist in any number of scenarios and any number of themes. It can also exist in environment as a theme. It can also exist in technology as a theme. It can also exist in feminism as a theme. So the more clashes you come to understand, and you have like better foresight of, I think it becomes easier to narrow down on what comparative to deal with and what comparative to run. But that doesn't mean that there will be situations where there are multiple correct comparatives. Then it just comes down to what, like, where are the two questions better answered for which comparative, of why is this true and why is this important. The comparative which meets the mark, I think you should go with that. In some motions, there are many stakeholders involved which hold the impact. Um, so I think the first thing is on this question about Gov having multiple stakeholders but Op having just one. So I think this is about being comparative on impacts, right? So the first thing that I would say is you need to comparatively explain why scale, because I think that's the more intuitive metric here, without, like, if there is no other context to go with it, why scale is something that we should care more about than say vulnerability. So I think here I would just explain that why all human lives should be assigned the same value. And then that would probably be the starting point of explaining why scale matters much more. That is one way. The second way in which you can explain scale to matter much more is to have a snowballing effect, and for it to also affect minority lives in the future, right? So if you have an impact on the majority, and the impact is paranoia, and the impact on minority is maybe they have better security protections, you can just very easily argue that this paranoia in the long run, when it snowballs, the way it's going to manifest is that some politician is going to come about and find a common enemy to channel all of this anger towards. People need to know the cause of the fear and uncertainty. Otherwise, it's very difficult for them to live calmly and peacefully. So they will latch on to this narrative, and then the security for these people in the long run is severely compromised, much more on intensity even. And then you can just argue why that's bad, because this just means more people hurt into the future and for a far more indefinite period of time. So even within weighings, you can use other kind of justifications to break this kind of a deadlock. So it is okay to do what you suggest, which is to move the debate to the different stakeholders. Maybe if you want to win on ops own metric of minorities, you can also do that. But in vast majority of instances, it's just easier to bring back the debate to the metric that you have identified, and then to explain why that makes more sense. Either you explain why the majority should actually be given more importance than the minority, where you explain that, oh, like most human people, like most people have it difficult in like their own ways, and hence no difficulty or suffering should be disproportionately assigned higher value. You make a brief explanation of that and then explain that's the justification why scale should still matter more. Or you can make an explanation of why on a timeline, or on a time weighing in the long run, it's just far more people are hurt, and it's just the same kind of minorities that op wants to defend, which also end up getting hurt in the like process. So a way to also defend op stakeholder is to start by defending gov stakeholder. So it depends is the answer, but you can do both in most instances. And in instances where you choose not to default to op metric, the idea would be to compare between the impacts and to compare between the weighings itself. Cool. I assume there are no other questions. If there are any, please feel free to reach out either on text or through the group chat itself. I will put down the document that I was referring to as a reference doc for people to view. Thank you for tuning in. Hope this was helpful. Feel free to reach out if there's anything at all. Good luck. Good night.
All right, then. Thank you so much, Sairam, for this wonderful session. We hope the participants learned from this. Thank you for joining, and we hope to see you tomorrow on the session that will be taken by Angad. Good night.